You're listening to Nightlight Radio Network. This is Dr. Bob Hieronimus, co-host of 21st Century Radio. We are happy to present this rebroadcast of our show on Nightlight. Oh, hot diggity dog, friends. One of the things I love about this job is reading in all the books that I get a chance to look at. And we have just received one of these 800-page books called A Terrible Mistake, The Murder of Frank Olson and the CIA Secret War Experiments. We have been waiting for this book for 20, 30 years. It's out. Good old by H.P. Albarelli Jr. And we're going to touch a tiny bit on this later on. Today, The Murder of Frank Olson and the CIA's Secret Cold War Experiments. Boy, they were terrible. All right. Well, are aliens really among us? A select group of people claim that they have direct contact with visitors to Earth. Today, more than half a century later, the Contactees are still telling their tales of personal alien encounters and maintain their cult-like status in the world of ufology. Nick Redfern's Contactees relates their thought-provoking, illuminating, controversial, of course, and sometimes bizarre stories in all their appropriately out-of-this-world glory. Nick Redfern is a full-time author and journalist specializing in a wide range of unsolved mysteries, including UFOs, alien contact, Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, government conspiracies, and paranormal phenomena. He writes regularly for UFO magazine, Fortean Times, Paranormal Magazine, and Fate. His previous books include Memoirs of a Monster Hunter, Strange Secrets, A Covert Agenda, and There's Something in the Woods. Hey, I didn't read that one. Among his many exploits, Redfern has investigated reports of aliens in Mexico, lake monsters in Scotland, vampires in Puerto Rico, werewolves in England. Almost said London. Remember that song? Yeah. And crashed UFOs in the good old Etats-Unis from a previous lifetime, United States. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio, Nick Redfern.
Hey, Bob. How's it going?
I am really fine.
Good.
I just enjoyed this book to pieces.
Oh, thank you.
Every now and then I get a chance to read stuff that as I keep thinking about from 40, 50 years ago. But, hey, did you hear about the book that just came out, 800 pages of A Terrible Mistake, the murder of Frank Olson and the CIA's Secret Cold War Experiments?
Yeah, I mean, I have actually heard about that book at all till you mentioned it. But, I mean, the story of Frank Olson is sort of like a definitive, it's one of the definitive accounts, not just of the Cold War, but of the whole era of Cold War issues relating to like mind control, and the CIA's use of exotic drugs to create altered states and things like that.
Oh, they wouldn't dare do something like that. Sorry, I'm sorry.
I think in that respect, it's a story that I think a lot of people are going to find interesting because a lot of people, know snippets of the Frank Olson story and the way in which, it developed and then how in later years the truth started to come out, and I think, it's, as you say, it's time that somebody told the story in full, so I'm glad that's now happened.
Well, I was looking forward to reading all the parts that Cheney and Rumsfeld had to deal with this, which they did, and, nice to have a vice president of the United States that was distributing LSD and with people who didn't know about it and stuff like that. Well, anyway, that's something else. But Contactees, what are Contactees?
Well, basically, Bob, the Contactees were, I guess, like a select group of people who, primarily kicking off in the late 40s, early 50s, but, some people say earlier, had contacts which I suppose differ very much from the more famous and more well-known abductions and abductees of today. I think with today's ufological field, most people who, whether new to the subject or not, are familiar with this whole scenario of sort of bug-eyed little aliens abducting people and subjecting them to medical experimentation. The Contactees, however, were very different in the sense that they had more of like a one-to-one spiritual communication with reported extraterrestrials in isolated locations such as deserts, forests, that sort of thing. So in other words, it was more along the lines of instead of being abducted and treated in a cold, clinical lab rat type scenario. It was really like a one-to-one exchange of ideas and thoughts on spiritual issues, the economy, the future of the planet and the human race, etc. And most of the contactees were kind of encouraged, whether consciously or otherwise, to go and spread the word, and relate the theories and ideologies of the so-called Space Brothers as they became known.
Well, we'll touch more on what the Space Brothers taught them, but I've always liked reading your work because I always find new stuff.
And, thanks.
And especially in regards to Walter Winchell. I had forgotten this. I only heard a little bit about July 9th, 1949. Walter Winchell brought to the attention of J. Edgar Hoover a story that he received from Mr. Jones of Los Angeles. I don't want to get too deeply involved in that, but I want to thank you for going the extra mile all the time when you do your research.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, I mean, this particular story, the Walter Winchell story, is interesting because most people kind of associate the contactee arena with the early to mid-50s onwards, but this particular case in question deals with an encounter that a man had in California in 1947 when he was out hiking in the mountains of California and saw this huge, I think he described it as being like a fairground, kind of like a circus tent type thing come down out the sky. It's like a big, huge balloon and land. And he felt, again, he had this feeling that it was extraterrestrially controlled and that the aliens possibly had some concerns about our development of atomic weaponry. And, of course, these were staple parts of the contactee movement of the 50s. But to find a story very similar but documented in the FBI files of the 40s, pushes back the barriers a little bit of when these encounters may actually have begun.
Mm-hmm. And also, thank you for the time you spent with Dan Fry. He was quite an interesting character. A lot of us had to spend time with him years ago, and I think he really added some light to Mr. Dan Fry there. Things that I couldn't quite figure out myself. The problem always is when you become friendly with some of these individuals. I hate to say I get biased, but I do.
Yeah.
If you like them as people, you kind of like to want to believe what they say. But obviously, a lot he had to say and do was quite questionable. But there was George Adamski almost before everybody else, who claimed to have met human-like aliens in the California desert, and that was 1952. Please tell us a little bit about Brother George Adamski.
Yeah, I guess really, Bob, Adamski, more than anybody else, was the one person who everybody sort of, I guess, associates with the contactee arena. And Adamski was born in Poland in the final years of the 19th century, and when he was just a small child, his family moved to the U.S., and he finally settled in California. And he actually had an organization in the 1930s called the Royal Order of Tibet, which was essentially a kind of alternative lifestyle spiritual organization. So, in other words, he was someone who was perhaps almost primed to have like an alternative UFO encounter because he had this background, I guess, in esoteric areas. And certainly that's what happened. He had a number of UFO sightings at a distance in the skies over California in the late 40s, but then said that while he was out with friends in the California desert in 1952, like a lot of the contactees, he felt compelled to go out to one particular area of the desert, and said that as he did so, this sort of classic flying saucer-type craft came down out the skies, landed, and this very human-looking alien got off the craft, which was described as looking like very much like a human being, but with long hair, and wearing what was described as kind of like a ski suit, like a one-piece ski suit type outfit. And there was reportedly a type of telepathic exchange rather than, a voice-to-voice communication, again warning about the perils of nuclear war, atomic destruction, things like that. And this, of course, was just the first, encounter that Adamski talked about. He actually reported, a number of incidents throughout his life and wrote a number of books, or co-wrote a number of books about his experiences, and his first book, for example, written with Desmond Leslie, an Irish author, actually sold in excess of 120,000 copies in its first printing. So it just goes to show, the sheer extent and level of interest in Adamski's stories.
What was he personally like?
Adamski was one of these people who, interestingly enough, like a lot of the contactees, was actually very down to earth, but on the other hand, telling an extraordinary story. And I think that typifies many of these people in the sense that it was almost like they were plucked out of nowhere to follow the approach that they followed. They went on this almost like a spiritual endeavor to spread the word of the Space Brothers, as these particular type of long-haired, human-looking aliens became known. And, it wasn't like he or Dan Fry or any of the others had anything particular about them that would make them stand out. It was almost as if, I kind of speculate in the book in places that possibly these extraterrestrial entities chose people at random so that perhaps, for example, the government, etc., wouldn't be able to track them down because there was no sort of rhyme or reason to the people they were picking. And I think that's typical with Adamski. He was just a normal person placed in an extraordinary situation.
Well, so thank you for what you had to say, and especially in tying George Hunt Williamson into George Adamski, who Hunt Williamson has written some interesting books, especially a lot of focus on South America down there and all the stuff that was going on down there. And a lot of people ignore Hunt Williamson, and I think that's a mistake.
Yeah, he was another person, with sort of similar beliefs and encounters and, in the same time frame as well.
George Van Tassel. Oh, that's an interesting name. He was a 1950s contactee, and he claimed again to have met aliens in the deserts of California. Can you elaborate on Van Tassel's claims of allegedly being taken aboard a spacecraft?
Yeah, sure. Van Tassel, like Adamski, was a very interesting character in that he had a notable background. In Van Tassel's case, he was actually a very skilled aircraft mechanic and worked for the Hughes Aircraft Company, owned and run by the well-known Howard Hughes. And actually, Van Tassel and his wife were good friends with Howard Hughes. And he and his family moved to an area in the California desert called just outside the town of Landers, which is about a 2.5-hour drive outside of Los Angeles into the desert. And he basically had an initial experience when out in the California deserts on one particular occasion, again feeling compelled to go out there with no sort of rhyme or reason as to why. His initial experience, he said, was almost like what today we would describe as, I guess, like an out-of-body experience, and what he described as an astral experience, where he felt, extracted from his body, if you like, and was put in communication with alien entities. Other experiences that soon followed were more of like a physical nature, but again, as with Adamski, the stories are very much one-to-one accounts of, exchanges on the perils of nuclear war, etc., etc. But whereas Adamski co-wrote a book and went on the lecture circuit, Van Tassel felt compelled to put on his own conferences out at this place called Giant Rock in the California desert, and so influential, I guess, and successful were they that at times he had audiences literally in figures of about 12,000 attending the conferences, which is kind of extraordinary for a UFO conference today, never mind 50, 60 years ago. But it kind of really goes to show the sheer scale of interest that existed back then in the contactee movement.
Nice photograph you included there with the giant rock actually being, was it an earthquake that did that?
No, actually what it was, it split, in 2003, and part of it came away.
Wow.
But there actually was an earthquake in the area, which Giant Rock actually survived the earthquake pretty much intact at the time. So.
Well, we have a little clip that we're going to be playing in a little while. After our break, we come back from Giant Rock, and some of the individuals there, what an interesting collection of folks they were. But we're going to take our first break. When we come back, obviously, FBI paid attention to these guys for very interesting reasons, and when we come back, we're going to find out why they wanted to focus on Adamski, Van Tassel, and others. With our guest, Nick Redfern. The book is Contactees, A History of Alien-Human Interaction, New Page Books.
Tell us in your own words about your trip to Venus, how it started.
Well, as I say, it started first with a very decided tingling all over my body. This tingling finally extended to the mind area, and there was a clarification of mind, such as it's hard to believe. I seemed to become one with the entire universe. Everything in the universe seemed to be contracted down to one small dot.
Whoa. Hey, that was Dana Howard. Good old tingling sensations. Oh, I have listened to these folks, these videotapes that we've had for 30 years or something like that. It's just lovely to hear Dana again. Wait till you hear some of the others, and we're going to hear some of the others. Oh, some of these contactees were, well, not the contactees, but the people that was contacting them were wearing red skirts, red pleated skirts, and black berets. Boy, it sounded like it was really. Did you like the way they dressed, Nick?
Oh yeah.
Wasn't that fun?
Yeah, sorry, I wondered if you were asking the audience then.
Well, yeah. But I just some of their stories are just terrific. Okay, now the FBI has released once classified files showing it spied very deeply on Adamski and Van Tassel. What do the files tell us about both of these guys and FBI's conclusions on the contactees?
Yeah, well, this is one of the interesting areas because, unfortunately, for a lot of people in the UFO subject today, they kind of write off and ignore many of the contactee reports, which for me is a big mistake. And one of the reasons I say that is because none other than, as you just pointed out, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI watched many of the leading contactees for literally decades. And, of course, an intelligence agency such as the FBI isn't going to waste endless manpower, time, money, etc., on watching people like this if they didn't feel there was a reason to do it. And, for example, George Van Tassel, who we mentioned earlier, his FBI file, which I managed to get hold of under the terms of the Freedom of Information Act, is 398 pages long. And for someone who's claiming to have met aliens out in the desert, that's a pretty extensive file. And, for example, he talks about how the FBI actually visited Van Tassel at his home in 1953. Two FBI agents traveled out there and spoke to him extensively about his experiences, which basically kind of touched upon things relative to where did he meet the aliens, what type of governments did they have, were they communist, were they, did they have a US or English type government? These were literally the sort of questions that were brought up. Why were they here? What was the reason for their interaction with the human race? And Van Tassel's FBI file covers 1953 to 65, so 12, 13 years. And that's pretty much the same with George Adamski. Again, to give you an example of the sheer extent to which Adamski was watched, in 1959 he went on a lecture tour in New Zealand, and the FBI even had reports sent to them from the State Department, the U.S. State Department representative in New Zealand, who actually, I guess, covertly attended one of Adamski's lectures and kind of prepared a review for the FBI on the lecture itself. So, in other words, they were watching these people very deeply. And what I get from reading the files is that the FBI was highly concerned about the way in which the contactees, I suppose, were influencing members of the public on large scales. For example, George Adamski selling in excess of 120,000 copies of his first book. So I think the FBI viewed the contactee movement almost as like a protest group of the 1960s that was challenging the conventions of society and telling people, or giving people the ability to live according to their rules and not the government's rules. And of course, governments don't like that. Hence the reason why they were watching these people.
Mm-hmm. Well, it looks like the corporate structures these days are going to be watching us all the more closely, controlling our elections in the future.
I'm sure.
Well, I know. Well, they wouldn't have done that in the past, of course.
No.
But only now. Only now. That never happened before. There.
No, of course not.
No, it's new stuff, Nick. Now, but you know, you on page 43. I selected 43 because I was born in 1943. Right there at the top, this is one of the things you educated me about: Adamski's racial and near-Nazi views. And then, of course, you touch on Project Paperclip, which, good Lord, most Americans have very little knowledge about that. And if you really want to get a good look at the Nazis, rocket scientists coming into America, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that's a good place to look. So there was some reason to look into these guys.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you know, when I talk about the FBI, for example, questioning people like Adamski and Van Tassel about the reported nature of governments and societies of these purported aliens they said they met, you know, Adamski himself actually said that in his view they had kind of like a communist, socialist type government. And certainly, you know, the overriding message from many of the contactees was that we should all live in peace with each other, that we should do away with money and, you know, all live at kind of the same level. Now, you know, if you're talking to just a group of friends about that, nobody really cares. If you're on the lecture circuit telling 100,000 plus people that aliens are communists and they have a wonderful world and we should abolish money and live, you know, all as one, then you are going to attract the attention of people like the FBI, purely because, you know, you're saying things that I suppose in the 50s, at the height of, you know, the Reds under the bed scares and McCarthyism and things like that, were going against the grain. And, you know, it wouldn't take the FBI long to find out that, hey, George Adamski's selling 100,000 books. George Van Tassel's getting audiences of 12,000 at these conferences. Very quickly, these people go from just UFO researchers and witnesses to, in the FBI's eyes at least, you know, potential national security issues.
Certainly. Now, here's another interesting fellow. I'm sorry for laughing. After you read these guys for 30 or 40 years. Yeah, but, you know, your book adds a lot of new stuff, though. That's the thing that's important about this work.
Yeah, I tried not to go over old ground and just repeat accounts.
Yeah, but who in the
hell...
bring
something new to it as well.
Yeah, who in the hell wants to read the same old stuff that we've been reading in the 50s, no, 60s, 70s, 80s? You've done some really important research, but that's what you're known for, Nick.
Well, thanks.
And that's the reason why individuals, obviously, not just enjoy your work, but learn a great deal from it. And then Truman, I can't know if I can get this guy's last name, Bethurum, thank you, who claimed to have been in touch with a beautiful female alien in the 1950s. Oh, this name is just great. Aura Rhanes.
Yeah.
Oh, what a beautiful name. Yeah, please tell us about this fellow. He's an interesting guy.
Yeah, Truman Bethurum, his story, in many respects, sort of follows the same pathways of many of the other contactees, but in other respects differs quite wildly. He was basically a very skilled, highway road builder. You know, he was someone who designed roadways and oversaw their production and construction, etc. And he was offered in the early summer of 1952 a new work contract working on an extensive new stretch of road in Nevada, which out about 2 hours' drive from Las Vegas. And this was very near a large old mesa called Mormon Mesa, you know, which went back literally millions of years when it was first, you know, sort of carved out of the environment. And he said that because his night shift, his working shift was something like from mid-afternoon till the early hours of the morning, when he got off of his duty at like 2 in the morning one night, he had to drive up the mesa and fell asleep and woke up to see this huge, literally like a several 100-foot definitive flying saucer come down and land. And when you read his book, it kind of sounds like almost like the scenario in Day the Earth Stood Still, you know, the old movie where this huge saucer comes down. And like many of the contactees, he said these very human-like aliens dressed in uniforms came out. The big difference in Bethurum's story was that whereas many of the aliens many of the contactees described meeting what became known as the Space Brothers. He had a sort of a definitive encounter with what could be called, I guess, a space sister. He said the person who was sort of leading the crew, if you like, of the craft was a beautiful spacewoman who identified herself as named Aura Rhanes. And she comes across as like a very ethereal, mysterious, or almost like magical character, who would sort of drift in and out of his life, and he would feel compelled to go out to the desert, and suddenly she would appear. It almost was like an altered state journey to, like a fairy kingdom or something like that in many respects, where, as if his mind was being played with, and suddenly this beautiful woman would appear. But again, the exchanges between the two of them were sort of very similar about the nature of the aliens' home planets, their reasons and motivations for coming here, i.e. to watch us and, gauge our development and things like that. And also a concern about the government not being able to track them and find them, and purely making their contacts at random, so there would be no way to sort of follow any definitive pattern as to where they were going to land and when. A very controversial story, and in many respects sort of really far out, but in other respects very similar to many of the other contactees. And what made Bethurum's story interesting for me was, in many respects, he didn't try and capitalize on it or expand on it. He said that basically his encounters occurred from the summer of 1952 to late 52, and then they just came to an end. These beings came, they had a number of interactions and exchanges in the desert, and then they were gone. So in other words, he wasn't trying to capitalize on it for years and years later, claiming all new experiences. It was just, hey, this is what happened to me X number of years ago, take it or leave it, which in many respects, adds weight to his claims. He wasn't just trying to come up with a new angle to get on the lecture circuit every other year, if you like. So.
Well, I like his comment on her. Well, he made a lot of them. Little did I suspect that their captain would turn out to be a woman. And what a woman. You're right so well. Because it's fun. There are certain areas that your humor comes out through there.
This is one of the things with the contactees that I try to point out, is that many of them were sort of definitive characters. Mm-hmm. I think, particularly in today's UFO world, it's all seen as very much black and white, and many of the witnesses, no disrespect, but, the stories are very similar, and many of the people come across very anonymous, etc. The contactees had real sort of standout, memorable characters, whether it was Adamski, Adamski come from Poland and then, setting up this organization, or Van Tassel hanging out with Howard Hughes, or Truman Bethurum, with his story. They were definitive, memorable people, and that's, with quirky characters in some cases. That's one of the things, I tried to get across in the book as well. So.
Well, you sure did. Look at this one up here. I'll hold it at the microphone. This is a description of Aura Rhanes. Listen, wearing a black and red beret and dark and large sunglasses. Boy, what an image. What an image that conjures up. With the collar of her jacket turned up high.
Yeah, this is one of the weird aspects of the story, because that particular description was made by Bethurum when he had an encounter with this woman, actually not late at night when she came out of the craft, but actually in Vegas itself. Now, of course, that sounds outrageous, but according to Truman Bethurum and many of the contactees, not just him, because these aliens look very human, with a few subtle disguises like sunglasses, hats, collars turned up, they could actually move amongst us and almost infiltrate us. Possibly, you could attach kind of like a sinister connotation to that word, infiltrate. Or you could suggest they maybe we're just trying to find out more about us. But many of the contactees claim this, that, the aliens weren't just coming down and having these meetings in isolated locations, but they're actually subtly moving amongst us, and that they look very much like us. But, if you were to catch one in the eye and look at them closely, there would be a few subtle differences, perhaps like the eye differences being slightly farther apart, or the nose is longer, or the lips in some cases were described as being very, very thin. But, with a few things like sunglasses, hats, etc., they were able to disguise that factor, and that was one of the points Bethurum touched upon in his particular description of Aura Rhanes that you just read out.
Well, you've made some major contributions to this area. And we're going to jump ahead when we return. There's plenty of others we need to talk about. Obviously, we need to talk about Antonio Villas Boas. Mm-hmm. What you have uncovered here is just brilliant. On Chapter 20, Inventing the Aliens. I'd like to, when we return, talk a little bit about Antonio, and then I could almost see that being that Antonio was with that red hair, and the snarling, biting.
Yeah, exactly.
I could see the picture was. You had a good picture there, when we find out that there is some kind of a link here between our government, possibly, and the contactees. I think this is, even though it may have been touched on by others, I think you really bring this out really well when we return with Nick Redfern, Contactees, A History of Alien-Human Interaction. New Page Books. Let's see, Nick Redfern, Fortean.blogspot.com. And that's linked to the front page of 21stcenturyradio.com. And a little Smoke on the Waters here. You know what Smoke on the Waters was all about? Huh? Do you?
Did he tell you where he came from?
Yes, this time he told me he was from Venus, although I have met men from other planets as well.
What were their clothes like?
The woman had a radiant red box-pleated skirt and a black velvet-appearing blouse and a black and red tam or beret, and the men had clothes very similar to our Greyhound bus drivers. Very similar uniforms.
Well, that proves that Greyhound bus drivers really were aliens. Isn't that right, Nick?
Well, you never know. Aliens could be in disguise anywhere, I guess.
Yeah, I guess so. But that was that famous line there. I enjoyed that great deal. Now, we got to move lickety-split. There's so much to cover. Well, I'll tell you what. Let's do Antonio first, and then we'll go into the possibility that the government had something to do with all this stuff. A Brazilian man named Antonio Villas Boas claimed a close encounter of a very sexual nature. Whoa, boy, with a female alien while on board a spacecraft. What are your views? Well, before I ask you your views, just tell us what happened, and then we can talk about those views.
Yeah, sure. This basically, Bob, is a story from '57, and in later years, Antonio Villas Boas, who lived in Brazil, became a very well-respected lawyer. In his late teens and early 20s, however, he was working on the family farm outside of Brazil. And on one particular night in '57, finished work and was sort of still sat on the tractor just waiting, taking a break before going home or driving home and across the fields, and said that he saw this strange light in the sky coming towards him, which obviously had no idea what it was, kind of looked like a star but getting closer and closer. And as it got, I guess, really close, he realized that it was some sort of vehicle, a type of which he'd never seen before, and he panicked, jumped off the tractor and basically ran as fast as he could towards the house. However, before he got there, he said the object obviously touched down on the ground, and a number of male aliens, he presumed, got off the craft, chased after him, dragged him down, and pulled him back and took him on board the craft. And it was while on board the craft that he said he was sort of rendered into like an altered state, as if he'd been drugged somehow, and his senses weren't quite what they should be. He felt groggy, and his mind wasn't reacting properly. But he said he was taken into one particular room, again, while still in this altered state, and said that when he was in there, this very, I guess, human-looking female alien came into the room, but she had, again, slight differences. Like, for example, her eyes were more, I guess, Asian/cat-like, almost in many respects. And whereas, within today's alien abduction stories, we hear everything about, aliens extracting human sperm and eggs and DNA, but in a cold and clinical scientific fashion, with Villas Boas, he claimed to have literally had sex with this alien woman, after which he kind of held a hand to her stomach and smiled and pointed to the sky, which he interpreted as meaning, she was an alien, and felt that this was sort of like some sort of genetic experimentation in the same way that we hear from the abductees today, but obviously, in a different fashion. And he sat on this story for a couple of years until he mentioned it to a friend, and then he got to a UFO researcher, and then, of course, the story spilled out. But until his dying day, Villas-Boas stood by this account, as he said it happened. And, again, as a respected lawyer, it certainly didn't do his career any good to talk about this, but to his credit, he said, I'm not going to lie and deny it. He said, this is what I recall happening, and related the story, as I said, to his last days.
Now, let's switch, go all the way up to chapter 20, Inventing Aliens. Now, there's been a lot of focused attention on this particular case, but some of us, including myself, had a few doubts about certain things. It's not that I don't believe that there are aliens or that UFOs, but there were certain things in it that indicated to me that maybe something needed to be uncovered, and your book does that in chapter 20 with Rich Reynolds, a long time. Tell us what Rich Reynolds has brought to the table that I wish would have been brought to the table on this a long time ago.
Yeah, well, I'm fully in agreement with you, Bob, that, I think there's a genuine alien presence here. And by alien, I mean literally, really unexplained, that has nothing to do, with hoaxing, misidentification, the government or anything. It's a definitively alien presence that moves amongst us. However, there are indications that at times government agencies may have tried to manipulate the UFO subject to promote different belief systems or to even stage UFO incidents to see how people might react in a real UFO experience. And this is one of the things that comes out in the Villas-Boas case. You mentioned Rich Reynolds, who's a friend of mine and a long-time, well-respected UFO researcher who's done a lot of high-quality research into the subject and dug deeply and extensively into it. And he had the occasion to interview a man who was actually involved with the U.S. government, named Bosko Nedeljkovic, a number of years ago, who claimed that although the Villas-Boas case was very, very real, he claimed that he didn't have actually anything to do with what we call, literal extraterrestrials, if you like. And according to, according to Nedeljkovic's story, the elements of the U.S. government, the U.S. intelligence community, were undertaking experimentation, mind-altering drug experimentation in the 50s, which we know went on. Ironically, it was one of the key staple parts of the Frank Olson story and this new book, that you mentioned at the beginning of the show. Yeah. But the story from Nedeljkovic was that the government knew that there were a number of genuine UFO incidents going on, but they decided to stage also a number of incidents, again, to see how the public would react, what the media reaction would be. And Nedeljkovic said that the Villas-Boas case was an example of this, where they flew a helicopter fitted with unusual lights and things like this over this particular area where the people, hadn't probably seen even helicopters before that much, and staged the incident where Villas-Boas was taken on board, drugged, and then subjected to an experience which may have involved a real woman, but also involved sophisticated mind-altering technologies, perhaps even holograms, and created devices, devices built to look alien, but actually didn't perform any real task as such, beyond, convincing the person that they were alien. And then it was kind of a case of letting the man go, letting the drugs wear off and him regain his senses, and then seeing who he told and how the response and what the response was, and then the CIA gauging, how the public and the media and the UFO community responded to this event, and it would allow them, in the event of a real, I guess, UFO invasion, if you like, to see how the public might react at a psychological and sociological level. And again, it's almost, the story is almost as controversial as the idea that Villas-Boas actually met aliens. Yeah. But when you take into consideration that we know that the government was doing some really weird, advanced mind control experimentation back in those days with things like MK Ultra and the Frank Olson story, it becomes actually quite plausible that this would spill over into the UFO field as well. Especially
since they were hoping that LSD or some of the other drugs they were experimenting with people who didn't know what was going on. I mean, yes. They didn't know they were getting LSD. Their hopes were to have some kind of truth serum, or and I've seen also written, and that's why I can't wait to read A Terrible Mistake, as developing contract murderers. Yeah, I mean, this is one of the interesting areas that, I focus on quite deeply in the book. I mean, another man who I talk about was Orfeo Angelucci, another famous contactee of the 50s. One of his prime encounters actually began when he said that this very human-looking person asked him to drink a liquid into which the person dropped a couple of pills. And it's quite clear from Angelucci's words that when he drank this liquid, that he was entered into an altered state. He talked about how everything around him the colors seemed to change. It was almost also as if just physical objects in the room seemed to take on lives of their own and seemed to have some sort of hidden meaning to them. And if you look at people under LSD experiences and you read Angelucci's accounts of, colors changing and swirling figures and magical experience, it sounds like he was put into an LSD-induced state. And what's particularly interesting is that he said that when he was in this state, he noticed in the location where it occurred, there were two, as he called them, Marines, military Marine guys, watching him very intently, as if they were almost there to monitor the situation. And as I speculate in the book, perhaps to ensure it didn't get out of hand. It certainly did happen with the Olson case, when he ended up going out of a window. So I think there's good evidence that some of these cases may have been staged events to allow the government to test out new radical means of altering people's minds and controlling them and gauging to what extent they work. If you convince someone they're seeing aliens, in other words, you can convince them of anything, I guess. Yeah, well, obviously, I think this was something the CIA at that time, I really, even though they got caught and even though it got out in the newspapers, I was just amazed that it reminded me a little bit of the situation with Richard Nixon, in which all the things he could have got caught at, what really brought him down was such a small thing in comparison to just outrageous things he was up to. So that I used to always hear, because I married into a heavily Republican family, and I've heard just about every excuse in the world as to why Richard Nixon was a great president, which obviously he was not. But still, it made no difference. Their feeling was, by and large, this is a good man. He only got him because he didn't know that these guys were doing what they were doing. Well,
poor Richard.
Yeah, poor Richard, right. Well, obviously, we're just about out of time for this hour. When we come back, we're going to talk about some more of these contactees. Oh, we've got to talk a little bit about the policeman taken aboard a UFO in '67. Now you see, this story in regards to the possibility that government has been utilizing these now is affecting me in every way I look at all of these other people and the experiences they had. Because were they genuine or were they products of our government? Well, we'll find out maybe when we get back with Nick Redfern, Contactees, A History of Alien-Human Interaction, New Page Books. You can reach Nick Redfern at nickredfernfordian.blogspot.com. But I used to love to sing these songs. Our guest for the next, we're about 10 or so minutes here, is Nick Redfern, Contactees, A History of Alien-Human Interaction, New Page Books. Go to nickredfern.com, which is linked on front page at 21stcenturyradio.com. That's 1-800-227-3371. Nick, could you please tell us the story about the policeman taken aboard a UFO in 1967 who claimed to have spoken with an extraterrestrial?
Yeah, sure, Bob. This relates to a man named Herbert Schirmer, a police officer who was actually on the early hours of December the 3rd, 1967. He was doing his his daily patrol in the town of Ashland, Nebraska. And when he was driving along, obviously, late at night, early hours, he saw this, what he thought, initially at least, was a truck broken down by the side of the road. And so as he closed in on it, he switched his headlights onto high beam to have a good look at it, and then realized that it actually wasn't a truck at all, that it seemed to be an oval-shaped object that was hovering about 8 feet above the ground, which had red lights, seemed to have red lights on the inside of it that were sort of shining through some sort of window-like opening on the craft itself. As he just sat there and watched it, because he didn't really know what to do, he said what looked like flames almost shot out of it, which was accompanied by what he described as a siren-like sound. But the object rose into the air and vanished as it just literally flew over his car, which was described as like a few feet above the patrol car, and was suddenly gone. Now, according to Sherman, the whole thing, from first seeing it to stopping, wondering what it was, and for it to leaving, took about 10 minutes. And right afterwards, he raced back to the police station to write up his report. But when he got back, he found that although he thought it had only taken 10 minutes, almost an hour of time seemed to be missing from his experience and from, his nighttime patrol. And obviously, wondering what happened, eventually he underwent regressive hypnosis to try and recover the missing memories of that 50 or so minutes that he couldn't account for. And when he was put under hypnosis by Dr. Leo Sprinkle, a psychologist, a story came out that what Sherman failed to remember was that, or his memory was wiped clean, was that he got out the vehicle and was approached by 3 human-looking creatures, around about 5 feet in height. And one of them, who he took to be the leader, as he described it, who was slightly taller than the others, asked him a question, said, "Are you the watchman of this place?" presumably meaning, a police officer. And he said yes. And he was basically taken on board the craft. And it wasn't described as like a kidnapping or an abduction. It was almost as if the aliens actually wanted him to see the craft, possibly even with the intent of having him go back and tell people about the experience, as if to sort of, again, get us acclimatized to the idea that they were amongst us. And he said that he went on board the craft, and again, there was an exchange about why the aliens were here, they were watching us, the nature of their technology. And just before the Sherman was taken off the craft, one of the aliens sort of made a curious comment to him and reportedly said, "We want you to believe in us, but not too much." And it was almost as if, as I speculate in the book, that the aliens want us to know they're here, but they don't want us to be too overly reliant upon them. The idea of one highly advanced culture overwhelming another culture. It's like they want us to believe in them, but not be reliant upon them teaching us everything. And I think, again, it was almost like a staged encounter in the sense of they deliberately wanted to have somebody on board who would go back and speak about it and subtly spread the message that, they were kind of moving amongst us at a restricted level.
That or it could also be that they're it's very similar to the Boas situation.
Yeah, exactly.
It could
the
be
Boas case. That we cannot discount the idea that, again, this was a staged incident. Hence, the human-looking aliens, and again, certainly, the government has done a lot of research into not just mind control, but mind manipulation, to wiping memories out, rendering people into altered states via advanced technology like acoustics. Been a lot of research done on acoustics, how they can render people into almost like a hypnotic state. And my personal view is that, if we ever get the truth about the UFO mystery, there's going to be our UFOs and their UFOs.
Mm-hmm.
There's going to be a real UFO phenomenon, but there's going to be evidence, if the story ever fully comes out, of how government agencies have also used the subject to their advantage to manipulate it and to manipulate us as well.
Yes, as my most favorite, actually I'm biased in this direction, a UFO researcher from the old school is Dr. Jacques Vallée, who, as you certainly well understood what he was talking about in this book, as more or less most of the, and the controversy Jacques went through back there, in the early 90s with all the other ufologists. I mean, they just really, they couldn't tolerate what he was saying, which he's saying, well, there may be UFOs, but that's not necessarily what we're looking at here.
No, and I think in that respect, I would sort of share a lot of Jacques Vallée's views in the sense that, he viewed the notion that there is a very real UFO phenomenon, and I don't doubt that for 1 minute, but I think the phenomenon itself has been manipulative, and governments have realized that there are ways in which, although there's a real phenomenon, they can manipulate it as well, and it becomes a case where it becomes harder and harder to differentiate which are between the real aliens and which is government agencies staging UFO incidents. And I think it is difficult to determine which cases fall into one category and which other cases fall into the other category.
Well, the final question I would need to ask you is, why did you write this book? I mean, most other researchers would have basically said, oh, that's been covered. We know all that field, and besides, who knows what they were in contact with. But evidently, you felt it was super important to put all this effort in. Why?
Well, I think there were several reasons, actually, Bob. One being that, a lot of people who today may be new to the subject have heard about Area 51, abductions, flying triangles. But because a lot of the magazines today are very much news-based, the tendency is, unfortunately, for a lot of the older historical stories to get lost and forgotten. And certainly in speaking with people in the subject who are new to it, many of them had no real inkling or idea as to what the contactee movement was all about. They just dismissed it based on a few fragmentary stories they'd heard here and there that people saying, oh, it's all nonsense, ignore it, let's focus on abductions, etc. So that was one of the reasons. The other one was that, a lot of words have been written about the contactee experiences. What I felt hadn't been done to a large extent was to try and explain what might lie at the heart of these stories, hence the reason why, as you know, in about the last 5 or 6 chapters of the book, that doesn't really discuss incidents, but discusses a whole variety of theories that might explain it, the phenomenon. So I felt that was important to get across, that there are actually a number of highly intriguing and potentially valid areas that might help us explain the mystery. And it has nothing to do, with hoaxing or just fantasizing, but some sort of far deeper and more controversial areas as well.
Well, I am very thankful you did so, because
thanks, Bob.
It means there's a lot of information I just obviously would have overlooked, because unfortunately when you do radio shows, you got to pick and choose the things you can't do everything.
No.
And usually if you had not written this book, I don't think I would have read it, Nick.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. I always try and bring something new to the table if I can, and try and get people thinking about the phenomenon. And if it brings the subject to a bigger audience and gets more exposure and gets more people asking questions, then hopefully more questions we get, the more answers we'll eventually get as well. So.
That's the way it works. Thank you for joining us, Nick Redfern.
Well, thanks a lot, Bob. Thanks for having me on the show.
You're very, very welcome. Contactees, A History of Alien-Human Interaction, new page books. You can reach Nick Redfern at nickredfernfortean.blogspot.com. 21st Century Radio is produced by Hieronimus and Company. Our executive producer and research assistant is Laura Kortner. I'm Dr. Bob Hieronimus, and remember, shine your shoes and get a haircut.